This is Kenya, a rich, prosperous land, but one that has been clouded for many months by a shadow of evil. For this is the land of the Mau Mau. Some are brought in to face justice, others are shot in fights with police and troops, but thousands more escape to continue their crusade of murder and violence.
Certainly, I'll do my best to do so.
So, Evelyn, will you tell us something about the present situation in Kenya?
Certainly, I'll do my best to do so. Now, you may very well ask, and very well wonder, given the numbers of people engaged on both sides, why it hasn't been stopped long ago. Well, the answer to that is that it may look extraordinary it's gone on for so long from Great Britain. When you're actually on the ground, it looks quite different. Because we are faced with very great difficulties, great physical difficulties. There are two large mountain messes quite close to the city of Nairobi. One round Mount Kenya, the other mountains called the Aberdares. Each of them is covered with forest, with very dense forest indeed. It's just as dense as what I imagine the Brazilian jungles are. And the Kikuyu were a forest people long before Europeans ever arrived in East Africa. The Kikuyu, that is to say, who are in Mau Mau, operate from those forests and have to be sought and have to be chased in them. That's our great difficulty. Let me go on and say this, that I think that this conspiracy, this violent movement, takes several forms. And we've got to fight it in whatever form it appears in. Sometimes it takes the form of large, comparatively organized gangs operating from these forest bases and attacking either European farms or even more, the villages and the houses of ordinary Kikuyu living in what is called the Kikuyu land unit. It is to say the main area, agricultural area for Kikuyu. Sometimes it takes a quite different form, of individual assassins mixing with the ordinary work people, going to work in the morning, coming back from work in the evening in the city of Nairobi. The first the military problem, the second the police one. Sometimes it takes a third form, of much smaller gangs, committing robberies, committing attacks, committing arson on houses either in the European farmlands or in the Kikuyu reserves. And that's a combination of a military and a police problem. Those are the three forms, and we've got to try our best to fight all forms, all those three forms.
They lived in the bush, they had long hair, some of them had game skins, coats around them. They ran on, carried a gun in one hand, and they ran like baboons through the bush. Now, in the forest, they were lying down watching you, and these poor lads would be coming along, walking upright, had no experience of bush warfare, it wasn't their fault, but actually fighting against people like that, they were useless. You had to hunt like you hunt a leopard or a lion, and you had to beat these Mau Mau at their own game. There was this chap, he'd seen me, and he was trying to get himself hidden in some stones. So I put a bullet straight behind his head. He came over backwards. His adjutant, the most awful fellow I've ever seen. Tall fellow with one eye, long hair, had skins all over him, got up and he took a horrible look at me and took off, and I thought I could shoot him like this, and I shot and missed him. Then I put the gun up and got him too. And there was another one running a short way over. When I put a bullet, turned out to be a young girl of 16. The ones they used to send in to get their food.
At Eastleigh Airport in Nairobi, the fine modern capital of the colony, the Governor, Sir Evelyn Baring, and General Erskine greet Walter Elliott and a small party of MPs who are visiting Kenya to prepare a report on the Mau Mau situation.
By the early part of 1953, it was clear that the settlers and the Kenya government had failed to crush African nationalism. In June, a full-scale military command was established.
The Mau Mau campaign is a war as important as that in Malaya, and just as ruthless. To aid them in their struggle, hundreds of loyal Africans, among them men of the Kikuyu tribe, keep constant guard. The investigating party examine the weapons with which the Home Guard fight. Crude, perhaps, but effective.
May I give a special message to those who have friends and relations in Kenya. I will do my utmost to relieve their anxiety.
At the height of the war, government forces numbered 11 regular army battalions, or about 13,000 soldiers, and more than 40,000 European, Asian and African police and home guards.
At one stage, at the early stages, 1 in every 3 adult males of the entire Kikuyu tribe was in detention.
In order to control the Kikuyu, who provided the overwhelming majority of the Land Freedom Army, The colonial government herded more than 1 million people into some 800 fortified villages. Here they were subjected to 23-hour curfews, forced labor, and constant surveillance. The Kikuyu Home Guard, formed almost as soon as the emergency began, was an irregular force of loyalists. They were armed at first with traditional weapons, and later with government-supplied modern ones. The real meaning of the emergency grew out of the bitter battles that took place between the Home Guards and the Land Freedom Army. Brother turned against brother, father against son.
As the fighting grew worse and worse, then there was a time when we were completely cut off and we had no communication even with our wives or our children, or even with our other forest fighters or sympathizers anywhere.
In the end, it was the mass roundups of Africans in trading centers and urban areas that broke the Land Freedom Army's chain of supply and manpower. The police and the army swooped and arrested indiscriminately, removing their victims to hastily erected detention camps scattered around the country. Throughout the emergency, any African was liable to be arrested anytime, any day, anywhere. In April 1954, this policy culminated in Operation Anvil, when the colonial government was prepared to screen every African in Nairobi. More than 20,000 were detained. From mid-1954, the Land Freedom Army was on the defensive. Amnesty offers tempted some to surrender. Leaders were killed or captured. Recruitment from the towns and villages dwindled.
The entire Kikuyu population was uprooted and herded into protected villages with home guards and watchtowers. This isolated the rural people from the gangs.
They had to build their own villages. It was done by compulsory labor, and we surrounded the villages in areas I was with ditches with spiked bamboos in the bottom. So it really was extremely difficult for anyone or any animal even to get through them.
Villagization removed the Kikuyu people from their farms into glorified concentration camps, where they were given 23-hour curfews, and as a battle measure, it was very effective. It stopped food supplies to the forest.
On the fringe of their reserve in Kenya, 23 Kikuyu chiefs gather to sign a declaration condemning the murderous activities of the Mau Mau. The document appeals to all Kikuyu to come forward immediately with any information they may have about the terrorist activities, and stresses that the Mau Mau's bestial ceremonies are contrary to ancient tribal tradition. Even as this loyal gesture is made, General China, the Mau Mau's second most important leader, is captured. Wounded in the neck during a clash with security forces, China, fearing that the Kenya Home Guard would kill him at once, surrendered to the King's African Rifles. Found guilty of consorting with armed persons, General China has now been sentenced to death by hanging.
The measures worked. The tide was turning against the gangs. Growing numbers of Kikuyu came over to the government.
At Nyeri, some miles north of Nairobi, Kikuyu Home Guard and other African police gather for a tribal meeting. This baraza, as it's called, has been arranged so the tribesmen may learn of the latest developments in the war against Mau Mau. Wearing their traditional costumes, about 11,000 wait in silence for the arrival of the governor of Kenya, Sir Evelyn Baring. Escorting Sir Evelyn is the Commander-in-Chief of Mau Mau Operations, General Sir George Erskine. Then Sir Evelyn outlines a new plan, an amnesty offer to the terrorists. Fundamentally, this means that any Mau Mau, whatever his past crimes, will not be hanged if he surrenders immediately. The governor then presents medals to police who have shown exemplary courage in clashes with Mau Mau. Whilst this ceremony is in progress, thousands of leaflets bearing the amnesty offer are dropped in Mau Mau territories. Already there has been fierce condemnation of the amnesty plan in Kenya. It has been described as exactly the same as offering Hitler an amnesty in 1943. However, supporters of the plan believe it is a worthwhile attempt to restore peace in the troubled land of the Mau Mau.
To the little town of Nairi in Kikuyu territory, Kenya police bring the biggest prize of the anti-terrorist campaign, Dedan Kimathi, self-styled field marshal of the Mau Mau organization. Kimathi was wearing a leopard skin jacket and cap, half disguise, half uniform, when they ambushed and wounded him. His capture followed weeks of planning. The Assistant Police Commissioner explains to pressmen how the net was tightened and the trap finally sprung. Police Corporal Wanjoni on the left was in command of the ambush, and tribal policeman Ndirangu on the right fired the shot which brought the terrorist leader down. 500 pounds was the price on Dedan Kimathi's head, and it's expected to go to the man who wounded him. Kimathi will be charged with carrying a lethal weapon, a capital offence in Kenya today. His capture will have a great psychological effect, for the Mau Mau leaders still at large are only small fry. Without Kimathi, Mau Mau's days are numbered.
In October 1956, exactly 4 years from the start of the emergency, Field Marshal Dedan Kimathi, overall commander of the Land Freedom Army, was captured. To the colonial government, the emergency was a war against criminals, and Kimathi was the arch-criminal.
Turned out by Kikuyu policemen from his own home district. Here are two of them, Corporal Wanjoi and tribal policeman Ndirango, who actually fired the shot which wounded Kimathi in the leg. He was trying to escape into the forest, which has known his reign of terror ever since the emergency began 4 years ago.
He was sentenced to death and hanged in February 1957. One of the last of the 1,068 Africans officially executed during the height of the struggle. On average, there was a hanging nearly every day for 4 years.
We thought that we had lost the battle with the capture of Dedan Kimathi, because he was the only outstanding person, the spokesman of the forest fighters. Now with his capture and his death, then that was the death of the revolution.
That is the military side of it. The other side of it, which is really equally important, perhaps more important, is that all the people, the Kikuyu people and others who've been supporting Mau Mau, have got to be completely and utterly disillusioned. And that could take a long time.
The battlefield now moved from the forests into the detention camps, from military to psychological warfare. More than 200,000 men and women had been arrested or detained during the emergency. At the end of 1956, some 30 to 40,000 were still in custody.
Some behind wire are fanatics, men who have taken degrading and beastly oaths, which put them beyond the pale of human society. Others, only tainted with subversive doctrines, are being shown the error of their ways and are slowly being rehabilitated.
Mr. Breckenridge, what do you see as the main aim of your rehabilitation work?
The main aim is to try and bring these rather
fanatical people back to normal life, to clear the Mau Mau out of their system and bring them back to normal, decent, civilized people again.
When, on rare occasions, we caught a terrorist and tried to interrogate him, to start with, there was no way you could get them to talk. And we and certainly the police and many of the police reserve tried methods that we would never normally accept. Electric shocks, that sort of thing. It was a waste of time. It didn't work at all.
The Europeans were convinced that Mau Mau was not politics, that it was not a political movement. As a result of being convinced of that, they had to find something else which it was. They believed that the oath which the Kikuyu took turned them into people who were no longer really human, but were animals. And in order to persuade them that they were no longer animals, they would have to be rehabilitated. And the first thing you would have to do in good old devil exorcising fashion was to confess your oath, to spit it out, to spew it out of your system. Then you were clean and new again, and you could be rehabilitated, you could be taught the correct approach to political development in Kenya.
There was not even the possibility of knowing who most of them were, because they made themselves bracelets, which they skillfully hammered like modern watch straps out of the corrugated aluminium huts, and they were identified by their own identification and not by district or by name or by tribe or anything else. They had their own identity and their own command.
The British attempted to regain control by dividing the prisoners into small groups.
Now, one of the worst things about the rehabilitation system was that it was held by the government that a short, sharp shock was needed for someone to confess his oath. And this short, sharp shock could only be given through violence.
They hurled themselves into a vast, tangled human mass. And we then physically moved in and manhandled them without what you might call punitive force or intimidatory force, what later came to be known as compelling force. They were taken by the hand, leg, wrist, whatever, and dragged out and frog-marched with whatever force was necessary, which was considerable. To handle a tough young man physically is very difficult.
And so I vividly remember once when I went to the Mwea camps, when the government had asked me to take over as rehabilitation officer, meeting the prison officer in charge, Superintendent Cowan, and he said to me, "Come on, let's go and have a look at it. It's all just like a good, clean rugger scrum."
In Marira Works Camp, we were taken from our cages early in the morning and spent the whole day under beating torture, forced to sing ridiculous songs. Detainees there looked mad, like those taken to Mathari Mental Hospital. It was so atrocious at Marira that 2 people were beaten to death during the time I was there. But what made it even worse was that the warders went on beating the bodies even after they were dead. Not only was this inhuman, it showed the whole stupidity of the rehabilitation orgy. We were treated in ways that no man would dare to treat an animal. We were told that we must confess in order to go through the pipeline. And if you refused, you were regarded as the worst type, a hardcore. A number of people resisted the pipeline, but many more succumbed to the extreme measures of torture. I was one of those who failed to go through the pipeline. I was too thick, as they said, and I was sent to Hola camp.
Those Kikuyu still held in detention were forced to work. From Aguthi camp came repeated allegations of brutality.
I would say that that camp was conducted with restrained harshness and severity, that it was extremely orderly and clean, but that probably a degree of physical violence was used to secure the obedience of those who might be thought to be a danger to the general stability of the camp.
Nerena mai ugatengerio kihoragwo ginyagia mai magwitikagire guku
ukakorwo ugithunguka kagoto kari loud tamaita 20 tari uraiga karai kauthi kari kiongo unyitite utengeretio ni thigari nacio ile laini o kihoragwo yani kuiga thigari uthire hari muthigari o kiguthagwo ugithiagira hari muthigari o kiguthagwo.
Here you were faced with someone who had taken an oath, who utterly refused to do anything you told him, who disobeyed an order because this was part of a political act on his part to disobey that order, and you were faced with this stone in front of you, and you had to make him do something. So you hit him, you punched him, you screwed him, you did anything you could to him to try and make him say, all right, I confess.
I got a letter which I couldn't ignore, which said, death of detainees in Aguthi camp. And then another letter came from them saying, please act else we shall all be dead. And therefore I always sent it to the Secretary of State. Of course, for verification. But what was so infuriating was that he always had an administrative inquiry, which meant that the very people who were in charge of the security forces who were committing these atrocities were the ones who sat in judgment on the case. And the whole instinct of the Europeans and those in charge was to cover up, always cover up.
The colonial secretary, Alan Lennox Boyd, continued to stand by the Kenya government.
We were certainly pretty nervous. As civil servants to the Secretary of State, we were very anxious that nothing disastrous should happen. But I don't recall any occasion on which any, as it were, explicit request was sent out to the governor by the Secretary of State, keep the violence down. Probably there was more done that didn't come to light than actually did come to light.
Why do you think they confess to their past crimes?
Well, it's very difficult to say. Even myself, I wonder sometimes how they do confess. Because this oath, the second oath, is one that if they do confess it, this oath can kill them. And it's really amazing how they do confess. I just don't really know how it is.
How few of them, or how many of them, refuse finally to confess and thus be released?
Up to now, we've only got one. We've had approximately over 700 in this camp.
One out of the total?
One out of that total 700.
But our next mind was conscious that there was this hidden bit of the iceberg of violence, I don't know.
But being an astute politician, he couldn't have been totally blind.
No. I think we all realise there must be a lot more. If there were one or two things going on, there probably was a lot more.
It was intrinsic in the whole attitude of the government of Kenya, as blandly endorsed by the Secretary of State, that an African life wasn't as important as a European life. That was the whole, almost subconscious approach of those in charge.
If a camp was far away from Nairobi, it was more likely that things could get out of control. If it was near Nairobi, perhaps the Red Cross might be taken to it, someone might come and inspect it, you had to be more careful. But basically what we must remember is that people died, many people died, as a result of the violence administered. Testicles were screwed off, people were punched silly, they were given cold water treatment, they were given electric shock treatment. Practically anything that you or I could think of was, in fact, probably in use in Kenya in one or other camp.
And do you have a great deal of success with your work?
At we're having about 80% success. We're sending down about 20% of our intake, which is 80 a week, down to a hardcore camp, and 80% are going through to final release.
And do you think that your rehabilitation produces really lasting results?
Yes, we do.
How confident are the European settlers in the redemption of Mau Mau? I asked this coffee planter if he now employs any.
Not that I knew of until today, when my head boy told me I'd got 5 ex-detainees.
Does that worry you?
No, not in the least. They've been through the pipeline and they've been properly rehabilitated in the reserve, and they're not allowed out of the reserve until they have been through this pipeline.
And you yourself, as person employing them, are quite satisfied that this process has completely done the trick?
Completely done the trick.
Within a year of the beginning of the emergency, while the Land Freedom Army was still on the offensive, the British government had begun to make the political concessions which only a short time before it had refused to consider. A new constitution was introduced in 1954, aimed at multiracial government. African political parties permitted again in 1955. African elections for the first time in 1957.
Can you imagine in Kenya, a place you've lived in for a long time, the day when Africans will govern the country and you will be governed by them?
Well, I haven't really given it an awful lot of thought.
Do you think it's possible?
Oh, yes, I think so, at a later date.
How would you react to that?
Well, I think we've all got to realize that one of these days we've got to accept it.
In 1959, when most of the world had forgotten Mau Mau and the detainees, and independence in Kenya was no longer a question of if, but only of when, the incident at Hola camp occurred.
On
the day of the infamous Hola massacre, detainees who were there and who were regarded as irreconcilable or the hardest of the hardcore were divided into 3 groups. One group was sent to the kitchen. The second group, of which I was a member, was sent to the dispensary for treatment. And the third group was taken to dig on the land, something we had always refused to do. Each of them was given a spade, a basin, and a hoe, and they were broken down into groups of 5 each. They were taken into the bush and ordered to dig, but they refused. And they were whipped and beaten, whipped and whipped, until 11 of them died. It was the greatest of brutalities, for among those who survived, none escaped permanent injury. Then, after causing helpless men to be beaten to death, the colonial government put out the lie that they had died from drinking poisoned water. An investigating team was set up, and the truth came out. Following this incident, the British government was rocked out of its stupor, for it realized that the settler government in Kenya had always been lying.
The outcry shook the House of Commons.
There we had the evidence, and I was able, through those documents, to prove to the House of Commons that these men had, in fact, been clubbed to death by illegal behaviour in the running of the camp.
The government of Harold Macmillan was shaken when one of their own leading backbenchers, a former minister, savaged them.
They had been warned that the policy which was being adopted could have this kind of result. Accordingly, the people who had adopted that policy must be held responsible for it. That was my argument, and that is my belief still. And that would mean that the governor himself would have to accept responsibility unless he could clearly be vested in someone else who had acted without his knowledge or authority.
When the story of Hola camp was ventilated in Britain in Parliament, it caused a tremendous sense of shock, because this was the first time that the British were made aware of the fact that their own colonial servants could behave in this fashion, and it took a lot of believing.
The whole philosophy and theory of rehabilitation in Kenya was based on the fact that Mau Mau was not political. This was proved wrong at Hola. MacLeod, the colonial secretary in Britain, recognized this fact and has himself said that Hola was the real turning point in his own views about Kenya. And the 100,000 people who went through this short, sharp shock, who were in various ways brutally treated, I think it is a very remarkable thing that they bore no grudge in the long run for what was really a very black page in British colonial history.
No senior official was dismissed over Hola. Some months later, Baring himself retired as planned. After Hola, the British released the remaining detainees. They simply went home.
Although the emergency came to an end officially in 1960, the most militant underground leaders were still kept in prison or restriction. Loyalists and moderates, on the other hand, were being recruited into the civil service as the British government pursued a new policy in Kenya, the creation of a stable and cooperative African government on which to confer independence.
Baring hoped that land reform and money for farmers would win over the remainder. While the chiefs accepted medals, the masses still looked to Kenyatta as their leader.
We were telling them that Kenyatta would never, ever return to the Kikuyu country. Never, ever. And we were making this promise to the loyalists, we were making it to the general public. This was, of course, supplemented by the fact that Kenyatta's name, his house was totally removed, his name was removed from everything. He was now to be a non-person.